Rostify's webinar, Retention as Recruitment, Turning Volunteer Experience into Your Strongest Attraction Tool. I'm Claudia, Marketing Manager at Rostify, and I'm excited to be joined by Katie Bradshaw. Katie is a volunteer management consultant with experience across national charities, membership bodies, and volunteer-led organisations. Rostify recently launched a new resource, the Volunteer Recruitment Playbook, which is a guide designed for organisations navigating modern volunteer recruitment pressures. If you haven't downloaded it yet, there's a QR code on the next slide. If you just move to the next slide, please, Katie. And we worked with Katie on this. She contributed a great chapter to this guide exploring retention as a recruitment strategy, which she'll be sharing how this all works in practice today through her 90-day volunteer framework. You'll see a question box in the top right corner of your screen, so please send any questions there throughout this session, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of Katie's presentation. So with that, I'll hand over to Katie to get us started. Thanks, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here today. As Claudia said, I'm Katie Bradshaw and I work as a volunteer management consultant. My work focuses on helping organisations to improve the volunteering experience, because when volunteering is well designed, well supported and properly valued within an organisation, it leads to stronger engagement, better retention and just better outcomes overall for the people and the communities that we serve as volunteer managers. I have worked across charities and volunteer-led organisations, supporting onboarding, recognition, training, using insight to improve practice, lots of different areas of volunteer management. And I've worked in organisations such as WizKids, Volunteering Matters, NCVO, CSSE. I've worked in a number of organisations, and I also am a chair of the board of a local charity as well. So my experience has given me a wonderful broad overall understanding of the voluntary sector and the impact that we can have as volunteer managers within that field. So one of the most common things that I hear across all of those organisations and the ones that I work with now is the idea of we need more volunteers. And I'm sure that sounds familiar to anybody working with volunteer management on this call. And it's not just anecdotal. 61% of volunteer charities are currently struggling to recruit volunteers, and 4 in 10 don't have enough to meet the demand of their services. What I often find, however, is that when we take a closer look, recruitment isn't always the core issue that we should be looking at, because organisations are bringing people in, but then they're not always staying. And because alongside recruitment challenges, retention continues to be a major issue, with around a third of organisations reporting difficulties in this area, I have worked with organisations who have really strong recruitment and have recruited a strong number of new volunteers, but a significant proportion of those haven't then come back to do a second or third day or second or third experience within the organisation that they're volunteering for. And that's not usually because they're not committed, but it's because the experience didn't quite match what they were expecting when they signed up to volunteer in the first place. And that creates a cycle where you're constantly recruiting, but never quite building that stable, engaged volunteer base that you're aiming for as an organisation. So I'm seeing some thumbs up, so I'm sure there's a few people who can relate to that. So what are we going to be looking at today? We're going to be looking at this volunteer recruitment challenge, but from the perspective of how do we utilise retention in order to improve this experience. So what's going wrong? If volunteers are coming in to the organisation, but they're not staying, it's worth asking ourselves, where is their experience falling short? In practice, what I often see is a gap. So that gap is between what volunteers expect when they sign up to be involved in the organisation versus what they actually experience in those early stages of their experience. And it's usually not one big issue. It's kind of a series of smaller moments that don't quite fit and don't quite land with what they expected when they signed up. So that could be, there can be a delay between someone signing up and actually getting started. And during that time, some of that enthusiasm and momentum drops off and people start to question whether or not their time is being valued within the organisation. Volunteers aren't always clear on what's expected of them, so the roles or the expectations that are on them when they start in their volunteer shift might not be as clear as they would like it to be. And also what good looks like. Sometimes volunteers don't know what good looks like within the organisation, and that uncertainty can really knock the confidence very quickly of a new volunteer. Early on, volunteers may also not feel connected to the organisation, so to the people, to the purpose, or to the wider organisation. And without that sense of belonging, it's very hard to hold a volunteer in place. And sometimes not having sort of clear opportunities to connect or to meet new people or to understand kind of what the organisation's culture is, that can be difficult for volunteers, especially coming into established volunteer teams. Sometimes I think you find that established volunteer teams who have been there for quite a long time, they can have a lot of experience and a lot of history within the organisation. And that experience, although incredibly valuable, can occasionally come across to new volunteers as, we've tried that before, or that won't work here. And, you know, what that can do, often unintentionally, is dampen the enthusiasm or make new volunteers feel like their ideas or their energy aren't quite right for the organisation. So that can sometimes happen as well. So, you know, rather than feeling like they're joining something that is dynamic and open, it can feel like they're stepping into something that's already fixed, and they don't know how they can build that early sense of connection with the organisation. People also come in with different motivations. So they might want to learn, to contribute, to connect, to give back to the organisation if they've had lived experience. And if the experience they're then having feels too rigid, too transactional, or disconnected from their original motivation, their experience can fall flat as well. So none of these things are unusual, and they're often not intentional either. But when they happen early, they have a disproportionate impact because it's the point where volunteers are forming their first impressions of an organisation and deciding whether this is something they want to continue with their free time. So with that being said, this is where I think we need to shift how we look at recruitment and retention, because if those early experiences aren't working, no amount of additional recruitment will solve that problem. Instead, what we often see is organisations working harder and harder and harder to bring in new volunteers, whilst unintentionally losing people at the same time. So it's like a sieve, you know, it's coming in, but it's going straight out. And that creates a cycle where recruitment becomes constant, but stability never quite builds within a volunteer set. So rather than asking ourselves, how do we recruit more volunteers? Instead, we should be asking, how do we create an experience that people want to come back to and tell others about? That should be the question we should be asking. Because when that experience is strong, volunteers stay, they engage more deeply, and they naturally encourage others to get involved. And that's the shift that we want. So 81% of satisfied volunteers say they're likely to continue, compared to 26% who are dissatisfied. So that's where that stick, you need to get them to stick at that point. So for me, retention is not just an outcome of recruitment, it should be your recruitment strategy. And we can think about this as a journey. So you have experience, engagement, retention, advocacy, and recruitment. So recruitment isn't just something that happens at the start. It is something that's generated by the experience that we create within our volunteering programs. And when this is working well, you're not relying solely on constantly finding new people. You're building a volunteer base that will eventually start to sustain itself, because people come back, people stay longer, and most importantly, they bring in others with them, which means you spend less time replacing volunteers and more time strengthening the experience that you offer to your volunteers. Okay, so if retention and ultimately recruitment is shaped by experience, the next question we need to ask is, when does this experience matter the most? And in my experience, there's a very clear answer. It's those first 90 days, because the first 90 days of a volunteer's journey are your most powerful retention tool. That's the point where you need to get them involved and get them to stay, because that is where everything is still being formed within the way that they think. It's where expectations are either met or they start to drift quietly away. It's where confidence is built or unfortunately knocked for a new volunteer. And it's where a volunteer decides, often without even realizing that they're making this decision, whether it feels like it's something that they want to be part of. So that first 90 days is really key to making sure that you're increasing the volunteer experience and helping to use that as a recruitment and retention tool. When someone signs up to volunteer, they come in with a picture in their mind. That might be the impact that they'll have as a volunteer. It might be the people that they'll meet, the connections they'll form, and it might also be just how they'll feel doing the volunteering. And in those early weeks, they're constantly and often subconsciously asking themselves, is this what I thought it would be? I mean, obviously, you can't meet everybody's expectations all of the time, but that is a key question that volunteers will be asking themselves. If the answer is yes, or even close to being yes, volunteers lean in to their volunteering experience. But if the answer is no, they start to step back from the organisation. And what's important to recognise is that most disengagement in a volunteering role doesn't happen later down the line. It happens early, and usually a volunteer who doesn't make it for their second or third event or shift within the organisation, they're the ones who might stop responding to emails after a couple of weeks. The volunteer who says, this isn't quite what I was expecting, by that point, they've already made their decision. You've already lost them, essentially. And if we can think back to some of the things we talked about earlier, like the delays in getting started, the lack of clarity, the limited connection with others within the organisation, they don't just create an inconvenience for volunteers, they shape that whole early experience that they're having with you as an organisation. So if we're thinking about retention as a recruitment strategy, the first 90 days are the point of highest impact, because a volunteer has a strong early experience. They're going to come back and they're going to engage more deeply with you as an organisation. Then they're far more likely to recommend their experience to others. But when that volunteering experience doesn't land early, we don't just lose that volunteer, we lose the potential people they may have brought with them as well, which is equally as important. So that's kind of the why do we have to think like this and why does it matter? I want to now talk through a model that will help you think practically about how we can improve those first 90 days so that we can use retention as a recruitment strategy. So I like to think of the 4 C's when I'm thinking about how we can intentionally design that first 90 days of a volunteer's experience. And that's contact, confidence, connection, and contribution. And throughout the rest of the PowerPoint, I'll go through each of these in turn. So, contact. This is what happens between somebody signing up and actually getting started within the organisation. This is the stage where we often see early drop-offs because due to delays, unclear next steps, or a slow onboarding process in general, that can really quickly drain the enthusiasm of a new volunteer. So I'm going to consider a case study with you all. Rachel signs up to volunteer at her local food bank. She's keen, motivated, and ready to get involved, but she hasn't heard anything for 3 weeks, and eventually she follows up with the organisation herself. She then receives a short text with a start date, but no further information about what to expect, what she'll be doing, or who she'll be meeting on that first day. By the time her first shifts arrive, that initial energy has already dropped and she's going in feeling a little bit unsure rather than excited about her volunteering experience. The issue here isn't the recruitment. We've recruited her. The issue is how the experience starts. So in practice, what this is about is protecting that early momentum with a volunteer. And we can do this by setting a clear internal standard for response time, so within 48 to 72 hours if we can, or at least have something that we can measure so that volunteers aren't waiting 3 weeks to hear back from an organisation they passionately want to be involved in. Provide structured welcome communication, so not just a confirmation email, but also kind of what happens next, so that when they get that first bit of information, they know what's going to happen next for them as a volunteer. Offering a first opportunity within a defined time frame. Now, I know that's difficult sometimes because of safeguarding or DBS timescales, but if we can aim to have the first opportunity for a volunteer to get involved within 7 to 10 days of them being interviewed or signing up or whatever your process is within the organisation, that keeps that momentum going early on. Also, sharing a simple first day overview, so sending a volunteer a crib sheet that just has, this is what your first day is going to look like, where to go, who they'll meet, what they're going to be doing, who to ask questions, where to get a cup of tea, because these are the things that volunteers feel nervous about asking, but then they don't always have this information, and having that in advance can just make sure somebody feels comfortable and that they've been contacted as part of that experience. So the goal we've got here is to move people from interest to action while their motivation is still high for the organisation. So the next thing we're going to consider is confidence. Confidence and clarity play a big role in somebody's first experience within an organisation. Once someone starts, do they feel confident in what they're doing? So again, another case study. James turns up for his first volunteering session at a community centre. He's completed some initial information beforehand, but when he arrives, it's not entirely clear what his role is on the day. Everyone else seems to know what they're doing, and he doesn't want to interrupt anybody or ask too many questions, so he muddles through but leaves unsure whether he did things correctly and whether he'd feel comfortable coming back because he didn't really enjoy himself. So the issue we've got is that uncertainty can quietly undermine confidence very quickly for a new volunteer. So what can we do about this? This is just about removing that ambiguity early on. And we can do that by providing short role-specific inductions focused on what they'll actually do on the day. We can introduce a what good looks like guide or checklist for volunteers to follow in those first few weeks. We can build in supported first experiences. So for instance, shadowing, co-working, guided tasks so that they know what they're doing in those first few days and they feel supported with that. We can make it explicit who they can go to for help and actively encourage questions from volunteers. Because what you'll find is confidence grows when expectations are clear and the support that they have is visible within the organisation. So our third C is connection. Do volunteers feel like they're part of something or just passing through it? That's the question. So Aisha starts a new volunteering role at a local charity shop and attends her first shift. Everyone is polite but very busy. Conversations are brief and focused on the tasks throughout the day. There is no real introductions. No one checks in with her directly, and she leaves without having had a proper conversation with anyone that day. On paper, everything has gone fine, but she just doesn't feel like she belongs. So what this is about designing for belonging, not leaving it to chance that people are going to make connections because we're human. It's about designing that experience so that people feel like they belong. We could introduce a buddy or a named contact for new volunteers on that day. We can build in intentional introductions at the start of sessions, get people in and half an hour earlier to do some proper introductions. We can create space for informal interactions, even brief but purposeful. So, by the way, so-and-so is going to have a 10-minute coffee break with you at this time, so you can have a catch up and find out how your day is going. We can include simple check-ins after the first experience and ask them not just, did you enjoy it, but how did that feel? Sometimes that's a more open-ended question that helps people kind of reflect on their experience. And we should be mindful of existing team dynamics and actively modelling openness to new people and new ideas of our volunteers. this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where existing volunteer sets can sometimes come across as a little bit unwelcoming, even when they don't mean to, because of the experience they have, the knowledge they share amongst themselves. So if we can model that openness to new people within our volunteer set, makes a huge difference. So our goal here is that belonging is created through small, consistent signals that someone is welcomed and included from day one. That's what we're trying to build. And finally, our last C is contribution. Do volunteers feel like they are adding value by being there, or do they feel like they're just observing their experience? So our final case study is Tom. Tom starts volunteering with an environmental group. For his first few sessions, he mostly observes and follows instructions, keen to listen and learn. However, no one asks for his input at any point, and there's little opportunity for him to take ownership of anything. Over time, he starts to feel a bit peripheral, like he's present as a volunteer, but he's not really needed. So what we have there is an issue where without contribution, we can't build commitment with a volunteer. That's about enabling early ownership for new volunteers so that they can feel like they're part of the design of the actual volunteering program. And we can do this by giving small, meaningful responsibilities from the outset to new volunteers, asking for feedback early, and most importantly, showing that we use that feedback, show how it's used. Inviting ideas, even informally, in those first few interactions. So how did you find today? Do you have any feedback? Is there anything we could do differently? And recognizing contribution really quickly and specifically. So saying to a volunteer, because you did this today, we achieved that. So it helps a volunteer feel like they're making a solid contribution from the start. Because what we find is that people are more likely to stay when they can see the value that they're bringing to an organization. It's very important for new volunteers. So what's the impact of this? What's important to remember here is that none of this is particularly resource heavy or complicated. You don't need to spend lots of money or invest huge amounts of staff and volunteer time, but what you do have to do is be intentional in your design. And in those first 90 days, small moments don't feel small to a new volunteer. They define their overall experience. But when we get that right, the impact is really clear. People don't just stay, they feel confident, connected, and valued. They engage much more deeply within the organization. And that's what leads to stronger engagement longer over time. And most importantly, they don't just stay, they bring others with them. So what this leads to is a shift in culture. So if we bring this all together, we started with a familiar challenge. We need more volunteers. But what we actually explored today is a different way of looking at that and realizing that often the real opportunity isn't about bringing more people in. It's about how we support the ones that we have who are already joining us. So because of that, retention isn't separate to recruitment, it drives it. And the point where that is most powerfully shaped is within those first 90 days, because that's where expectations are formed, that's where confidence is built, and that's where people decide whether or not they feel part of something or part of the organisation. And what we've seen is that those small changes in that early experience across early contact, confidence, connection, and contribution can have a significant impact on whether volunteers stay, whether they engage, and ultimately whether or not they bring others with them to the organisation. And when that happens, something within that organisational culture to do with volunteering shifts, because we spend less time constantly replacing the volunteers that we've lost and more time strengthening the offer to the volunteers that we keep. And that creates something even more powerful, because volunteers don't just stay, they begin to advocate for your organisation. They talk positively about their experience to friends, family, colleagues. They recognise their contribution and they feel part of an organisation, so they take ownership over that recruitment part as well. And importantly, they help to shape the culture for others by welcoming new volunteers with energy, openness, and encouragement. And what that does is it strengthens the next person's 90 days as a result, and it creates a cycle of good experience from the start. So the takeaway from this session is, don't just focus on how you recruit volunteers, focus on how the first 90 days feels when they start, because experience is your most powerful recruitment tool, and so is retention. Thank you, and I'd love to answer any questions if anybody's got any.
Thanks so much, Katie. Really great session there. Some positive comments coming through already, and that 4Cs model is a really great way to think about the volunteer experience. So yeah, we'll open it up to questions now. If you haven't sent them through already, feel free to pop some questions in the question box in the top right corner of your screen. One, to get us started, volunteers wanting to help on an occasional or short-term basis is becoming more and more popular, that flexible or micro volunteering. How does that still apply with this model in mind?
I think it absolutely does apply, because retention doesn't always mean that what we're looking for from a volunteer is a long-term weekly commitment, but retention sometimes means whether that person comes back again if there's another opportunity. So if we look at, for instance, let's take a really standard short-term or flexible volunteering opportunity like cheering at the marathon at the weekend. So you have people who will volunteer to stand and cheer for the people who are running on behalf of your charity. Yes, maybe they like the idea of doing that because they've run a marathon themselves in the past and they're not doing it this time, but they would like to do something to do with the event. But that person can then have a experience where if they really enjoy themselves, they're not only going to volunteer, they're not going to volunteer every week, but they are much more likely to return when the next time you need somebody to cheer, or come to a fundraising, or come to an event that you need bodies on the floor, essentially. And they're also much more likely to advocate for you as an organisation. So I cheered for such and such charity at the weekend and I had a really good time. Oh, that's funny, because I was thinking about volunteering somewhere. Would you say they're good for looking after volunteers? That's the type of conversation that comes even from just investing in that first day that somebody has with you as an organisation.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that word of mouth recruitment is so important. That was found in our report last year as the strongest recruitment strategy. So
yeah, absolutely. People want to hear that other people had a good experience. That's important to people.
For sure. So we've got some more questions here. Retention in the first 90 days feels more difficult when we have a long onboarding process. Often depends on the time it takes volunteers to move through these stages. So the training, interviews, DBS checks, etc. Do you have any tips here?
Yeah, so I guess I completely understand. My first tip would probably be double check if they need to be DBS'd. I think we have a habit in the voluntary sector of over DBSing our volunteers. I haven't got the tool on me now, but there is a great tool on the government website where you can go through and it asks you specific questions about what somebody's going to be doing in their role and tells you whether or not somebody needs to be DBS'd or not. Because actually we over DBS and you can actually get fined for doing too many DBSs for roles that you don't need to. So that'd be my first advice. Double check we need to DBS, because we do have a habit of overdoing it in the voluntary sector. My second bit of advice would be keep in touch with the volunteer during that time. Give them things that they can potentially do without being DBS'd. So yes, they have to do training because it's statutory in a lot of cases and they need to be able to do certain things to perform in the role. But does that mean they can't shadow another volunteer? Does that mean they can't come in for the day and see what happens? Can we not have phone calls with them throughout their onboarding experience to check in? And, taking half an hour to sit down with a volunteer, or even 10 minutes, and say, really looking forward to you starting. It's great that you're getting on with the training. We're still waiting for your DBS, but tell me a little bit more about why you wanted this role, because I'd love to shape your experience from the start to make sure this fits what you want. That kind of early contact makes somebody feel valued. So even if you're not able to get them started within 7 to 10 days in a new role, you can certainly give them that feeling of being part of the organisation from much earlier.
keeping that communication up and engagement through that process.
Yeah,
for sure. Any tips on how to encourage existing volunteers to be more welcoming to new volunteers?
Yeah. So it is something that I see quite often. That's why I wanted to bring it up as part of this presentation. And like we've probably all been there ourselves. We've worked in an organisation for 5 years, and a new member of staff comes in and says, "Oh, I've had this idea," and you go, "Oh, yeah, we did that a couple of years ago." And actually, we don't realise the impact that has on somebody's confidence on their first couple of days. My advice would be to encourage volunteers to feel like you're not telling them that they're being intentionally unwelcome, but what we can do is start a culture conversation rather than a blame conversation with volunteers. So ask them, help us shape a welcome for volunteers. What does a positive welcome look like? What would you as a new volunteer want when you came into the organisation? Giving them an opportunity to feel like they're taking part in creating that induction process really helps them kind of respond more positively. And sometimes it's also just about creating awareness. So being like, if you say for the charity shop example we gave earlier, if two of the volunteers have known each other for 20 years and they're, gabbing away to each other in the back room, catching up about family, and you see that as a volunteer manager, I would feel quite comfortable with volunteers to say to them, by the way, I love that you guys have got such a good relationship and you've made such firm friends through volunteering, but just be conscious that we might have a new volunteer come in, and, make sure you leave space to have conversations with them as well, and make sure they feel welcome. They're all adults at the end of the day, and it's often not intentional, but it is a difficult, sensitive subject.
For sure. What is the best way to celebrate exceptional effort from a volunteer without making others feel undervalued?
That entirely depends on the volunteer, I think. So, for instance, if I had done something exceptional as a volunteer, being the type of person that I am, I'd quite like an Oscar, an acceptance speech, horse and carriage down the mile. I'm joking, but I don't mind being celebrated. I quite enjoy that limelight that I get from that. My best friend, on the other hand, would rather curl up and die than be put in a situation where she's being publicly celebrated. She recently got Employee of the Month, and she was like, "Mate, I want to turn my camera off at the meeting." So I think it's really about getting to know your volunteer and what they would want, how they would want to be celebrated. So some people would love their name to be mentioned in a newsletter. Other people would much rather get an email from the CEO that's private that just says, "I've heard that you did a really good job." How do you do that without making other volunteers feel, what was the second part of that question?
Undervalued.
Sorry, say that again.
Undervalued.
Create a culture of value all the time. So, create a culture where you're often feeding back on things. You might not have a volunteer who does something exceptional every week, but the fact that they turn up every week and give their time is exceptional in itself. So just create a culture where you're always saying to volunteers how valued they are, and you do that in a way that speaks to them most as an individual. But also sometimes people are competitive, so sometimes seeing that another volunteer is getting recognised is enough to get other people to kind of do stuff as well. But I do personally think it's very much down to the individual volunteer and understanding kind of what feels like recognition for them.
For sure. Another one here. I wrote my recruitment strategy 2 months ago and said exactly this. So if you have any tips in driving forward the culture of change within my organisation, I would be grateful.
Great. I can't see you or your recruitment guide at the minute, your recruitment plan, but my information, my website and stuff are on the screen, so please feel free to get in touch with me separately, and I'm happy to help you in any way that I can.
Let's see what other questions we have. We have volunteers that are 90% remote and working with young people. There can be quite a few volunteers that take a while to be matched. While we do communicate this to volunteers and offer opportunities to socialise, any other ways to work on those 4 C's?
Yeah, so that's tricky. So I worked at the Girls Network, and there was some volunteers who took a long time to get involved because of matching with as mentors to the girls that they were working with. I think when you are doing remote stuff and it takes a while, having good training in place is a really good start, because it's something that they can get on with while they're waiting. Being, like I said earlier, having those conversations, checking in with people throughout the time that you're waiting to match as well, and find out more about them. Just because they've signed up to, I don't know, say, let's go with that mentor example, they've signed up to be a mentor, doesn't mean they don't have any other skills that they can't be utilizing with you as an organization in the meantime. So, find out, what do you enjoy, what are your skills, what do you want to learn about, and try and match them with other opportunities as well, because sometimes you'll find somebody is like a LinkedIn whiz as well as wanting to mentor, and can they give a seminar to your staff on LinkedIn and the importance of it, or can they speak to some of your service users, say like with the Girls Network, about how you can engage with LinkedIn that doesn't involve them needing to be matched. So I think it's just about thinking kind of creatively about how you can fill that time, but also just establishing from day one how expectations will be met. So, if it is a long onboarding process and it does take time, just let them know that. Be really clear from the start. This is how long it usually takes. This is the reasons why it takes this long, and these are the things that we can't do anything about in order to make it better. However, here's the training. Here is some contact details of some people you can talk to. Here is the contact details of another volunteer who's more than happy to chat through what they get up to. Give them those touch points to make connection, to build clarity, and to build confidence from day one.
Thank you. And another question, how do we know if our first 90 days are working well?
Oh, that's a good question. So how do we know if they're working well? I suppose it's about measuring impact. So you can start pretty simple. So how long does it take for somebody to get started within the organisation? Whether they come back after their first or second session, and early feedback, encourage that early feedback, that opportunity to kind of have conversations early on. Even a short check-in or short survey can be really useful at this stage. So can you put together a 5-question survey that you send out to volunteers after their first shift? Literally, how did you find it on a scale of 1 to 10? Is there anything we can do differently? That sort of thing. What you're essentially looking for is patterns. So where are people leaning into you as an organisation, and where are they quietly dropping away? And that's how you can measure the impact of your first 90 days.
Sounds good. Yeah, there's a section in the our new recruitment guide that talks about measuring what matters, and a few examples in there of a few metrics that you can pick to start turning that data into stories and seeing what's working, what's not. Once you make one change, measuring it, and kind of going from there. I think we've gotten through most of the questions. So thank you so much again, Katie, for taking the time to answer those questions and share that strategy. I saw someone ask if we'll get the slides will be shared, and absolutely, we've recorded today's session, so you'll get a copy of that straight to your inbox along with the slides, Katie's details, the recruitment playbook, and some upcoming webinars. We've got another webinar in a couple of weeks talking about building thriving volunteer communities. So yeah, more webinars focused on recruitment coming up. So we'll leave it there, and thank you very much to Katie and to everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, everybody. Lovely to meet you all.